I was 5 years old, standing alone in the middle of Westfield Shopping Center in Denver, clutching my torn teddy bear while hundreds of strangers walked past me, like I was invisible. My parents Derek and Susan Walsh had told me they were going to get ice cream and would be right back. That was 3 hours ago. The mall security guard found me crying by the fountain, completely abandoned. I had no idea that this moment of devastating betrayal would eventually lead to me sitting in a courtroom, 22 years later, wearing judge's robes while my biological parents stared at me in absolute shock. The security guard who found me was a kind woman named Maria Santos. She knelt down to my level, her voice gentle, as she asked where my parents had gone. Through my tears, I explained that Mommy and Daddy said they'd be back with ice cream. Maria's expression shifted from concern to alarm as she realized what had happened. While we waited for the police, a quiet man in a simple gray suit approached us. He was maybe 40 years old, with kind brown eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, and prematurely graying hair. His name was Thomas Richardson, and something about the way he looked at me made me feel less scared. I couldn't help but notice, Thomas said to Maria, his voice soft and careful. "Is the boy lost?" Maria explained the situation while I hugged my teddy bear tighter. Thomas crouched down beside me, his movements slow and non-threatening. "What's your name, son?" he asked. "Ashton," I whispered. "That's a strong name. I'm Thomas. Would you like to sit down while we wait for some people to help us find your parents?" When the police officers arrived, along with a social worker named Mrs. Janet Palmer, Thomas stayed with me. He bought me a juice box from a nearby vendor and sat patiently while they asked me questions about my parents, our address, and what had happened. The officers spent 2 hours trying to locate Derek and Susan. They checked the parking lot, reviewed security footage, and called the number I recited from memory. The phone had been disconnected. Our apartment address led to an empty unit with a "For Rent" sign in the window. "It appears this child has been intentionally abandoned," Mrs. Palmer told the officers in a voice she thought I couldn't hear. Thomas overheard too. He approached Mrs. Palmer with a determined expression. "I was adopted myself when I was young," he said quietly. "I know how terrifying this must be for him. Would it be possible for me to provide temporary care while you sort out the placement process?" Mrs. Palmer looked surprised. "Sir, that's very kind, but we have procedures. Background checks, home studies interviews." "I understand completely. I run a small accounting firm here in Denver. I have clean records, stable income, and a quiet apartment. I'm not asking to skip any steps, just requesting consideration if you need immediate placement." That night, after emergency background checks and several phone calls, I found myself in Thomas's modest apartment above his accounting office on 17th Street. The space was small, but spotless, with books lining every wall and a comfortable couch that he quickly converted into a bed for me. "Are you hungry, Ashton?" Thomas asked as he rummaged through his kitchen cabinets. I nodded, still clutching my teddy bear. Thomas made scrambled eggs and toast, cutting the bread into triangles the way my mother used to. As I ate, he sat across from me with a cup of coffee. "I know today was scary," he said, "but I want you to know that you're safe here. Tomorrow Mrs. Palmer will come check on us, and we'll figure out the next steps together." That first night, Thomas read me 3 picture books he'd quickly purchased from a nearby bookstore. His voice was calm and steady, nothing like my father's impatient tone when he occasionally read to me. When I had a nightmare around midnight, Thomas appeared in the doorway within seconds. "Bad dream?" he asked gently. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I dreamed Mommy and Daddy came back, but then they left again." Thomas sat on the edge of the makeshift bed. "Sometimes, our minds try to process scary things through dreams. It's normal to feel confused and sad. Would it help if I stayed here until you fall back asleep?" Over the following weeks, Mrs. Palmer visited regularly. Each time she seemed more impressed with Thomas's care and my adjustment. He'd enrolled me in kindergarten at the neighborhood elementary school, bought me new clothes, and established routines that made me feel secure. Mr. Richardson. Mrs. Palmer said during one visit, "Ashton seems remarkably well-adjusted, given the trauma he's experienced. You've created a stable environment very quickly." "He's a resilient kid," Thomas replied, watching me color at the kitchen table. "He deserves consistency and patience." The formal adoption process began 3 months later. Thomas never pressured me or made promises about the future. He simply showed up every day, helped with homework, made healthy meals, and listened when I talked about missing my parents despite everything. 6 months after that terrible day at the mall, we were finalizing the adoption paperwork in Thomas's home office. As he organized documents in a filing cabinet, I wandered around the room curious about the books and certificates on his walls. Behind a tall bookshelf, I noticed what looked like the edge of a door. "Thomas, what's behind here?" I asked, trying to peer around the bookshelf. Thomas's head snapped up from his paperwork, and I saw something I'd never seen before: panic in his eyes. He quickly moved to where I stood, gently guiding me away from the bookshelf. "That's just storage space for client files," he said, but his voice sounded different, strained. His hands were shaking slightly as he positioned the bookshelf more securely against the wall. "But it looks like a door," I persisted with the curiosity of a 6-year-old. "Some clients require very private record-keeping," Thomas explained, kneeling down to my level. "Part of my job is protecting their confidentiality. Do you understand?" I nodded, though I didn't really understand. What struck me most was how nervous Thomas seemed, so different from his usual calm demeanor. But I trusted him completely, so I didn't ask more questions. That night, as Thomas tucked me into bed, in what was now officially my bedroom, I felt safer than I had since before that day at the mall. Whatever secrets Thomas kept behind that hidden door seemed less important than the fact that he'd chosen to love me when my own parents couldn't. The years that followed were the happiest of my childhood, though they were also filled with growing mysteries about Thomas's life. By day, he ran Richardson and Associates from the office below our apartment, handling bookkeeping for local restaurants and small businesses. His clients were ordinary people, shop owners, contractors, a few doctors. Nothing glamorous or suspicious. But the evenings were different. As I grew older, I began noticing patterns. Thomas would receive phone calls after 9 p.m. that he always took in his bedroom with the door closed. I could hear his voice through the wall, but it sounded formal, professional, using words I didn't understand. The provenance documentation is conclusive. I heard him say one night when I was 7. The brushwork analysis confirms our initial assessment. When he emerged from these calls, he'd be dressed in his usual casual clothes: khaki pants, button-down shirts, comfortable shoes. But sometimes I'd catch glimpses of expensive items appearing and disappearing from our apartment. A leather portfolio that looked more costly than anything else we owned. Art books with glossy pages, showcasing paintings I'd never seen before. Once a small sculpture that sat on our kitchen counter for exactly 2 days before vanishing. "Where did the statue go?" I asked Thomas over breakfast. "It belonged to a client who needed some research done," he replied, pouring orange juice into my glass. "I was just holding it temporarily." When I turned 8, Thomas enrolled me at Denver Academy, a prestigious private prep school on the other side of town. The tuition was more than most families in our neighborhood made in a year, but Thomas insisted I deserved the best education possible. "How can we afford this?" I asked during the car ride to my first day. "I've been saving since the day you came to live with me," Thomas said. "Your future is worth any sacrifice." At Denver Academy, I excelled academically. My teachers praised my analytical thinking and verbal skills, particularly in debate class, where I learned to construct logical arguments and identify weaknesses in opposing positions. Thomas attended every school event: parent conferences, science fairs, debate tournaments, beaming with pride at my accomplishments. But the mysteries continued to multiply. When I was 12, I noticed Thomas leaving the apartment around 10 p.m. twice a week, always dressed in the same simple gray suit he'd worn the day we met. He'd return around 2 a.m., careful to be quiet, but never quite quiet enough to avoid waking me. When I asked where he'd been, his answers were always vague. "I do consulting work for clients who keep unusual hours," he'd say. "Some people prefer privacy for their business dealings." The expensive items became more frequent and more obviously valuable. Art catalogs from auction houses in New York and London, books about Renaissance painters and authentication techniques, phone conversations that included phrases like verification process and market evaluation. During my sophomore year of high school, my curiosity finally overcame my respect for Thomas's privacy. On a Tuesday night, when he left for one of his mysterious appointments, I waited 30 minutes, then followed him. Thomas walked 12 blocks through downtown Denver, moving with purpose through areas I'd never seen him visit. He stopped in front of the Morrison Gallery, one of the most exclusive art galleries in the city. But instead of going through the main entrance, he walked around to a service door in the alley. I positioned myself across the street, hidden behind a parked delivery truck, and watched as Thomas used a key to enter through the back door. 20 minutes later, I crept close enough to peer through a side window. What I saw made no sense. Thomas stood in an elegant room filled with wealthy-looking people in expensive clothes. But he wasn't dressed in his simple gray suit anymore. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his hair styled differently, carrying himself with the confidence of someone completely at ease in this world of obvious money and sophistication. He was examining a large painting with a small group of well-dressed collectors, pointing out details with the authority of an expert. A woman in diamonds hung on his every word as he explained something about 17th century techniques and characteristic brushstroke patterns. I watched stunned for nearly an hour. This wasn't the modest accountant who made me breakfast every morning and helped with my algebra homework. This was someone else entirely, someone who belonged in this world of wealth and expertise. When Thomas finally moved toward the back door, I ran home as fast as I could, arriving 20 minutes before he did. When he came through our apartment door, he was back in his simple gray suit, carrying his worn leather briefcase, looking exactly like the Thomas I'd always known. "How was your evening?" he asked, hanging his jacket on the chair by the door. "Fine," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. "Just finished my history paper." "Good. I'm proud of how hard you work at school, Ashton. Your dedication will serve you well in life." That night, lying in bed, I tried to process what I'd witnessed. Thomas was living a double life. But why? And if he was connected to such wealthy people, why did we live so modestly? Why did he work so hard at his small accounting business when he obviously had access to a much more lucrative world? The questions multiplied, but my love and trust for Thomas never wavered. Whatever secrets he kept, I knew with absolute certainty that he cared for me genuinely and completely. He'd proven that through 7 years of patient, consistent love. But I also knew that someday I'd need to understand who Thomas Richardson really was. By the time I graduated from Denver Academy as valedictorian at 17, I'd decided to pursue law. The debate competitions had shown me my talent for logical argument and justice. But more than that, I wanted to help children who'd experienced what I had. Family law felt like my calling, a way to use my pain for something meaningful. Thomas was overwhelmed with pride when I received a full academic scholarship to the University of Colorado Law School in Boulder. We celebrated at a modest restaurant downtown, and I watched him beam as he talked about my future. "You're going to make a real difference in the world," he said, raising his glass of water in a toast. "Children who've been failed by the system will have an advocate who truly understands their experience." But during my second year of law school, I began noticing changes in Thomas. He'd developed a persistent cough that he dismissed as seasonal allergies. He seemed more tired than usual, sometimes falling asleep in his chair while reading the newspaper. Most concerning, he'd lost weight. Not dramatically, but enough that his clothes looked loose. "You should see a doctor about that cough," I told him during one of my weekend visits home. I'm fine, Ashton. Just getting older. Happens to everyone. But the cough worsened, and I started finding excuses to visit home more frequently. During my spring break, I discovered prescription bottles in his bathroom medicine cabinet. Medications I'd never seen before with names I didn't recognize. "Thomas, what are these pills for?" I asked, confronting him in the kitchen. He sighed, looking older than his 55 years. "I didn't want to worry you during such an important time in your education." "Worry me about what?" "I've been having some health issues. Nothing dramatic, but the doctors want to run some tests. It's probably nothing serious." I knew he was minimizing the situation, but I also knew Thomas well enough to understand that pushing too hard would make him retreat further into secrecy. Instead, I made a decision that would change both our lives. "I'm taking a semester off to help you through this," I announced. "Absolutely not," Thomas said firmly. "Your education comes first. I've spent 12 years making sure nothing interferes with your future." "And you've spent 12 years being the only family I've ever really had," I replied. "I'm not going anywhere." The fight that followed was our first real disagreement, but I won. I deferred my spring semester and moved back home to take care of Thomas while he underwent medical treatment. The diagnosis came 3 weeks later, pancreatic cancer stage, 3 aggressive but potentially treatable with immediate intervention. The oncologist, Dr. Patricia Walsh, no relation to my biological parents, explained the treatment plan with professional compassion. "The next 8 months will be difficult," she told us. "Chemotherapy, radiation, possibly surgery. But Mr. Richardson is otherwise healthy, and we've caught this before it spread significantly." What followed were the most intense and meaningful months of my relationship with Thomas. The treatments were brutal, leaving him weak and nauseated, but they also brought us closer than ever. During his recovery periods between chemo sessions, we had conversations about life justice and purpose that shaped my understanding of the world. "The most important thing I can teach you," Thomas said during one of our long talks, "is that wealth and status don't determine a person's worth. I've met billionaires who were spiritual bankrupts and homeless people who possessed more wisdom than entire university philosophy departments." "Where did you meet these billionaires?" I asked, still curious about his mysterious double life. Thomas smiled weakly. "In my consulting work. Someday when you're older, I'll explain everything. For now, just know that I've tried to live my life in a way that would make you proud." I graduated from law school a year later with Thomas in attendance, despite his ongoing treatments. He looked frail in his wheelchair, but his eyes shone with pride as I walked across the stage to receive my degree. 3 months later, I passed the Colorado bar exam on my first attempt. "I always knew you'd become something special," Thomas whispered that evening as we celebrated quietly at home. "You've already accomplished more than I ever dreamed possible." But the cancer was stronger than the treatments. By the time I turned 25, Thomas's condition had deteriorated significantly. He spent his final weeks at home with hospice care, and me by his side constantly. During those last days, Thomas tried repeatedly to tell me something important about his past, but the pain medication made it difficult for him to speak clearly. I caught fragments, something about authentication work, and providing for your future, and people who knew your value before you knew it yourself. The important papers are in the safe behind the bookshelf. He managed to tell me 2 days before he died. "Mrs. Stevenson has the combination. She'll explain everything." Thomas Richardson died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March, with me holding his hand. He was 68 years old, and he'd been the only real parent I'd ever known for 20 years. The funeral was scheduled for the following Friday at St. Mary's Cathedral downtown. I expected a small gathering, maybe 20 people from his accounting business and a few neighbors. What happened instead changed my understanding of everything. More than 200 people attended Thomas's funeral. They arrived in luxury cars and designer clothes, filling the cathedral with the quiet sophistication of serious money. I recognized none of them, but they all seemed to know exactly who I was. A woman in an elegant black dress approached me during the reception, her jewelry clearly worth more than most people's annual salary. "You must be Ashton," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm Charlotte Morrison from the Morrison Gallery. Your father was one of the most brilliant art authenticators and dealers in the world. He helped our family recover millions in stolen paintings that had been missing since World War II. I stared at her speechless. "He never told you about his real work." She continued, studying my expression. "Thomas was internationally renowned for his expertise in Renaissance and Impressionist authentication. He consulted for museums, collectors, and law enforcement agencies around the globe. We called him when other experts couldn't definitively verify pieces worth tens of millions of dollars." Another man joined our conversation, distinguished probably in his 70s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Thomas saved my family's reputation," he said, introducing himself as Judge Robert Hamilton from the Colorado Supreme Court. "When our collection was questioned during an insurance claim, his authentication work proved our pieces were genuine. He was scrupulously honest in a field where many experts can be influenced by financial considerations." As the afternoon progressed, person after person shared stories about Thomas's expertise, integrity, and generosity. Art dealers from New York, museum curators from Los Angeles, collectors from Europe who'd flown in specifically for his funeral. My modest, quiet father, who'd lived above an accounting office, had been living a completely double life as one of the most respected art experts in the world. Everything I thought I knew about him was simultaneously true and incomplete. The reading of his will was scheduled for the following Monday at the law office of Margaret Stevenson, the attorney who'd handled his legal affairs for over 15 years. I spent the weekend in a daze, trying to reconcile the man who'd made me pancakes every Sunday with the international expert who'd helped recover millions in stolen art. Margaret Stevenson's law office occupied the top floor of a downtown Denver high-rise, with panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains and furnishings that suggested very expensive clients. Mrs. Stevenson herself was probably 60 with silver hair and the confident demeanor of someone who'd spent decades handling complex legal matters. "Please sit down, Ashton," she said, gesturing to a leather chair across from her mahogany desk. "I know this week has been overwhelming for you." "That's an understatement," I replied. "I'm still trying to understand who Thomas really was." Mrs. Stevenson smiled gently. "Thomas Richardson was exactly who you knew him to be, a loving father who devoted his life to your well-being. He was also a brilliant professional who chose to keep those worlds separate, to give you a normal childhood." She opened a thick folder and withdrew several documents. "Thomas's will is comprehensive but straightforward. He leaves you the accounting business, the apartment, and all personal belongings. He also leaves you the contents of his investment accounts, which total approximately $5.6 million. I nearly fell out of the chair. "I'm sorry, did you say $5.6 million? "Yes. Thomas invested wisely over the years, but he lived very modestly to ensure this money would be available for your future. He also left you this letter." Mrs. Stevenson handed me an envelope with my name written in Thomas's careful handwriting. With trembling hands, I opened it and began reading. "My dear Ashton," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and Mrs. Stevenson has explained the scope of my estate. I know the amount will shock you, so let me explain how this money was earned and why I chose to keep this part of my life private. For 30 years, I worked as an art authenticator and dealer specializing in stolen and recovered pieces. This work put me in contact with extremely wealthy people, law enforcement agencies, and international art recovery organizations. The money I earned came from legitimate consulting fees for expertise that took decades to develop. I lived modestly, not because I was poor, but because I wanted to give you a childhood rooted in real values rather than material excess. I wanted you to understand hard work, appreciate education, and develop empathy for people struggling with real problems. If you'd grown up knowing about this wealth, it might have changed your character in ways I couldn't predict or control. Every dollar I saved was saved for you. This money is yours not because of biology or legal obligation, but because you've earned it through 20 years of being the son I always hoped for. Use it wisely. Use it to help others, and never let it change the fundamental goodness I've watched you develop. The hidden room behind the bookshelf contains my authentication equipment and records. Mrs. Stevenson will help you decide what to do with those materials. Some clients may contact you seeking closure on unfinished business, but you have no obligation to continue my work unless you choose to do so. I love you beyond measure, and I'm proud beyond words of the man you've become. Live a life that makes the world better than you found it. It was signed simply Dad. I sat in Mrs. Stevenson's office for nearly an hour, reading and rereading the letter, while she patiently answered my questions about investment accounts, tax obligations, and legal procedures. By the time I left her office, I was officially one of the wealthiest young men in Colorado, though I had no idea what to do with that reality. The following months were a period of adjustment and discovery. I used some of Thomas's money to start my own family law practice, specializing in cases involving children in crisis. I also established a nonprofit organization called the Richardson Foundation, dedicated to helping abandoned and neglected children find stable families. The work felt meaningful and connected to both my personal experience and Thomas's values. Within a year, I was handling custody cases, adoption proceedings, and child welfare investigations throughout the Denver metro area. The foundation helped place 43 children in loving homes during its first 18 months of operation. Life felt purposeful and positive for the first time since Thomas's death. I'd found ways to honor his memory while using his gift responsibly. I was 27 years old, professionally successful, and genuinely happy. Then everything changed with a knock on my office door. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, almost exactly 2 years after Thomas's funeral. My secretary had left early for a dental appointment, so I answered the door myself. Standing in my law office doorway were Derek and Susan Walsh, my biological parents who'd abandoned me at Westfield Shopping Center 22 years earlier. They looked older, obviously, but well-dressed in expensive clothes that suggested recent financial success. Susan's blonde hair was professionally styled, and Derek wore a suit that probably cost more than most people spent on clothes in a year. But their eyes held something desperate that no amount of expensive styling could hide. "Hello, Ashton," Susan said, her voice shaking slightly. "I know this is unexpected." Derek stepped forward, extending his hand with forced confidence. "We've been trying to find you for years. When we learned about Thomas's passing and your situation, we felt it was time to reconnect." I stared at them, feeling like a 5-year-old child again, confused and abandoned and terrified. "Reconnect?" I managed to say. Susan's carefully composed expression crumbled, and she began crying. "We were so young and stupid when we left you. We thought we couldn't handle being parents, but we've regretted it every day since. We hired private investigators, checked adoption records, searched social media. We never stopped looking for our son. We know we made a terrible mistake," Derek added quickly. "But we're your biological parents. That bond can't be erased no matter how much time has passed." They asked to come inside, and against my better judgment, I let them. For the next 2 hours, they told an elaborate story about being overwhelmed young parents who made a horrible decision in a moment of panic. They claimed they'd been searching for me ever since, desperate to make amends and rebuild our relationship. But something in their demeanor didn't ring true. Their story was too polished, too rehearsed, and the timing of their appearance exactly when my inheritance became public through probate records seemed more than coincidental. "We understand you've done very well for yourself," Derek said as the conversation drew to a close. "We're incredibly proud of what you've accomplished." "We don't want to disrupt your life," Susan added. but we hope we can be part of your future. We want to know our son again." After they left, I sat in my office replaying every word of our conversation. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Their story was emotionally manipulative, but potentially believable. Their timing was suspicious, but not impossible to explain. I decided to hire my own investigator to verify their claims before making any decisions about contact. What Jackson Murphy discovered over the following 3 weeks destroyed any possibility of reconciliation. Derek and Susan hadn't been searching for me at all. They'd made no effort to locate me until 6 months ago, when a private investigator they'd hired for completely different reasons had accidentally discovered my identity through probate records related to Thomas's will. They were in serious financial trouble. Derek had borrowed $800,000 from questionable sources to fund a series of failed business ventures, including a restaurant franchise that went bankrupt and a real estate investment scheme that turned out to be fraudulent. Susan had developed a gambling addiction that had consumed their remaining assets over the past 3 years. The people Derek owed money to were not patient creditors. They'd already repossessed his car and threatened foreclosure on their house. Worse, Jackson's contacts suggested these creditors had connections to organized crime and were becoming increasingly aggressive about collection. Derek and Susan's sudden interest in reconnecting with their abandoned son had nothing to do with parental love and everything to do with financial desperation. 3 weeks after their first visit, they returned to my office with a lawyer. "We've consulted with legal counsel," Derek announced, "and we've learned that as your biological parents, we have certain rights regarding inheritance matters." Their attorney, a man named Bradley Cooper, with oil-slicked hair and an expensive suit, laid out their position with practiced arrogance. "My clients deeply regret the circumstances of their separation from Ashton," Cooper said, "but that separation doesn't negate their biological relationship or their legal standing as his parents. The inheritance Mr. Richardson left was essentially a gift to their child, regardless of who provided his care during the intervening years." "We're not asking for everything," Susan said, though her tears looked rehearsed this time. "We just want what's fair. Half of the inheritance would allow us to rebuild our lives and start fresh with our son." $2.8 million, Derek added. "It would solve all our problems and give us the resources to be proper parents to Ashton going forward." Cooper leaned forward in his chair with the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating people. "If we can't reach an amicable agreement," he said, "we're prepared to file a lawsuit claiming parental rights to the inheritance. We believe any reasonable court would agree that biological parents have superior claims to assets left to their minor child regardless of subsequent adoption arrangements." I looked at these 3 people, my biological parents and their lawyer, and felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood: pure helpless rage. "Get out of my office," I said quietly. "Ashton, please," Susan began. "Get out now or I'll call security." They left, but Cooper's final words echoed in my mind. "We'll be filing papers within the week. You should consider hiring legal representation." The lawsuit was filed 5 days later in Denver District Court, Walsh versus Richardson Estate, claiming that Derek and Susan Walsh, as biological parents of Ashton Richardson, formerly Ashton Walsh, had superior legal standing to inherit assets left to their minor child. The case that would define the rest of my life was about to begin. Bradley Cooper filed the most comprehensive and aggressive lawsuit I'd ever seen, claiming not only that Derek and Susan had parental rights to Thomas's inheritance, but also that Thomas himself had acted improperly by alienating a minor child from his biological family and exerting undue influence over a vulnerable child for financial gain. Cooper's strategy was brilliant and completely ruthless: portray Thomas as a wealthy predator who'd essentially bought a child and me as either a willing conspirator in fraud or a naive victim who'd been manipulated my entire life. The preliminary motions painted Thomas as someone who'd deliberately targeted an abandoned child to groom for inheritance purposes, claiming he'd used his wealth to purchase loyalty and create an artificial family relationship for his own benefit. Thomas Richardson was a wealthy man with no natural heirs, Cooper argued in his opening filing. When he encountered an abandoned child, he saw an opportunity to create a grateful beneficiary who would validate his emotional investment with financial loyalty. This inheritance represents not love, but the culmination of a 20-year manipulation scheme. Reading those accusations about Thomas felt like being stabbed repeatedly. Every word attacked not just the legitimacy of our relationship, but the integrity of the man who'd saved my life and shaped me into the person I'd become. I hired Sarah Martinez, one of Denver's most respected family law specialists, to represent me. Sarah was a fourth-generation Colorado native with 15 years of experience in complex adoption and inheritance cases. She was also a former prosecutor who understood how to fight against aggressive legal tactics. Cooper's approach is disgusting, but not necessarily ineffective, Sarah explained during our first strategy meeting. He's trying to exploit the fact that inheritance law sometimes treats adopted children differently from biological children, especially in cases involving large sums of money. But Thomas legally adopted me, I protested. That gives me the same rights as any biological child. Under normal circumstances, yes. But Cooper is arguing that your adoption was fraudulent from the beginning, that Thomas used his wealth to manipulate the system and deprive your biological parents of their rights. The discovery process that followed was the most invasive experience of my life. Cooper's legal team demanded financial records, school transcripts, medical files, therapy notes, and detailed depositions about my entire relationship with Thomas. They interviewed Mrs. Palmer, the social worker who'd placed me with Thomas 22 years earlier. They contacted my teachers from Denver Academy, asking whether Thomas had seemed unusually invested in my academic success. They even subpoenaed records from Thomas's art authentication business, looking for evidence that he'd planned to involve me in his work. Mr. Cooper is trying to establish a pattern of grooming, Sarah explained after reviewing their depositions. He wants to convince a jury that everything Thomas did for you, the education, the stable home, the emotional support, was calculated to create obligation and gratitude that would justify this inheritance. But Cooper's investigation also revealed information that helped our case. Mrs. Palmer's records showed that Thomas had been thoroughly vetted before my placement with background checks, psychological evaluations, and home studies that exceeded normal requirements. My teachers consistently described Thomas as a loving parent who prioritized my well-being over academic achievement. Most importantly, Cooper's team uncovered evidence of Derek and Susan's actual history after abandoning me. This is where their case gets interesting, Sarah said, spreading documents across her conference table. Your biological parents weren't just young and overwhelmed when they left you at the mall. They were facing child endangerment charges for leaving you alone in their apartment for 2 full days, the month before the abandonment. The court records revealed a pattern of neglect that contradicted Derek and Susan's claims about being devoted young parents who made a single mistake. They'd left me unsupervised multiple times, failed to provide adequate food and clothing, and had been reported to child services by concerned neighbors. Social services had already removed you from their care once, 6 weeks before the mall incident. Sarah continued. They'd regained custody only after completing parenting classes and promising supervised care. The mall abandonment happened during their probationary period. Even more damaging to their case was what happened after they abandoned me. When social services finally tracked them down 3 months later, they were living in Las Vegas with new identities, Sarah explained. They'd changed their names. Derek was working under the table at a casino, and Susan was dancing at strip clubs. When presented with the option to regain custody of you or sign away their parental rights to avoid prosecution, they chose to sign away their rights. I stared at the legal documents, hardly believing what I was reading. They voluntarily terminated their parental rights. Completely and legally. The termination was processed through Clark County Family Court in Nevada. They signed affidavits stating they were unfit parents and believed relinquishing their rights was in your best interest. Does Cooper know about this? Sarah smiled grimly. He should know about it. It's public record, and any competent attorney would research their client's legal history before filing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. But based on his filings, it appears he either didn't do proper research or he's hoping we won't discover these records. Cooper's case began falling apart during the deposition phase. Under oath, Derek and Susan's stories contradicted each other repeatedly. Susan claimed they'd been searching for me every single day since the abandonment. But Derek admitted they'd made no effort to contact me until learning about the inheritance. Their financial desperation became obvious during questioning about their current circumstances. Derek owed money to multiple creditors, some of whom had connections to organized crime. Susan's gambling addiction had consumed over $300,000 in the past 5 years. Most damaging of all, neither of them could provide specific details about my childhood, my interests, or my personality. When asked about my academic achievements, Derek guessed I'd been probably average in school. Susan couldn't remember my birthday. These people don't know you at all, Sarah observed after reviewing the deposition transcripts. They're strangers trying to claim money from a stranger they happen to share genetics with. But Cooper wasn't finished. 3 weeks before trial, he filed an emergency motion claiming that the original parental rights termination had been signed under duress because Derek and Susan were facing criminal prosecution. He argued that people couldn't make free legal decisions while threatened with jail time, so the termination should be invalidated. He's desperate, Sarah said, but this motion isn't completely without merit. Courts sometimes overturn decisions made under extreme pressure, especially involving parental rights. The judge scheduled a hearing on Cooper's motion for the Friday before our Monday trial date. If he succeeded in invalidating the parental rights termination, Derek and Susan would legally be my parents again, which would strengthen their inheritance claim considerably. I spent that weekend preparing for the possibility that I might lose everything Thomas had left me to the people who'd abandoned me 22 years earlier. But I also spent time thinking about what Thomas would want me to do. He taught me that justice wasn't always about winning, but about standing up for what was right regardless of the outcome. If Derek and Susan wanted to fight for Thomas's money, I would give them the fight of their lives. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in November in the Denver District Courthouse. Judge Patricia Williams, a respected 15-year veteran of family court, presided over Walsh v. Richardson estate with the gravity that multi-million-dollar cases demanded. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread through Denver's legal community about the unusual case, and several reporters had come to cover the story of biological parents suing their abandoned child for inheritance money. Cooper's opening statement was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation disguised as legal argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the fundamental bonds of family and the corrupting influence of wealth on natural relationships. Derek and Susan Walsh were young parents who made a terrible mistake 22 years ago, a mistake they've regretted every day since. But their son Ashton was taken in by a wealthy man who used money and influence to permanently separate a child from his biological family. Cooper paced in front of the jury box with practiced confidence, his voice rising and falling to emphasize key points. Thomas Richardson was a millionaire art dealer who saw an opportunity to purchase something money can't usually buy: unconditional love and gratitude from a child. He used his wealth to provide luxuries and opportunities that young parents could never offer, creating an artificial loyalty that culminated in this inheritance. Cooper's strategy was becoming clear: make the jury see Thomas as a manipulative predator and me as either his victim or his accomplice. The Walshes aren't asking for charity, Cooper continued. They're asking for justice. They're asking this court to recognize that biological parenthood creates bonds and rights that can't be erased by abandonment, adoption, or even time itself. Ashton Richardson is their son, and Thomas Richardson's fortune represents compensation for 22 years of stolen parenthood. Sarah's opening statement was shorter, but more direct. "This case is not about family bonds or parental rights," she said, facing the jury with quiet confidence. "This case is about greed. Derek and Susan Walsh abandoned their 5-year-old son in a shopping mall and never looked back until they learned he'd inherited money. They didn't search for him, they didn't miss him, and they don't know him. They're not here as parents. They're here as strangers demanding payment for DNA." Sarah turned toward Derek and Susan, who sat beside Cooper at the plaintiff's table. For 22 years, these people lived their lives without giving any thought to the child they abandoned. Thomas Richardson, meanwhile, devoted his entire life to raising that child with love, patience, and integrity. The inheritance at stake represents not Thomas Richardson's wealth, but his love made tangible. The question for this jury is simple: should love be rewarded, or should abandonment be subsidized? The first week of testimony established the basic facts. Mrs. Palmer, now retired, testified about finding me at the mall and the extensive process of placing me with Thomas. She described Thomas as the most thoroughly vetted prospective parent she'd encountered in 30 years of social work. My teachers from Denver Academy testified about Thomas's involvement in my education, describing him as a devoted father who attended every school event and prioritized my character development over academic achievement. Dr. Margaret Foster, my high school guidance counselor, testified that Thomas had sought her advice about helping me process my abandonment trauma. Mr. Richardson never spoke negatively about Ashton's biological parents, Dr. Foster said under direct examination. His focus was entirely on helping Ashton develop confidence and resilience despite his early trauma. He was the most psychologically healthy and committed parent I worked with during my entire career. But Cooper's cross-examination was brutal and effective. "Dr. Foster, isn't it true that wealthy parents often receive preferential treatment in schools like Denver Academy?" "I wouldn't say preferential treatment, but resources certainly help." "And isn't it true that Mr. Richardson's wealth allowed him to provide opportunities that most parents couldn't afford?" "Yes, but financial resources don't automatically create good parenting." "But they do create gratitude in children, don't they? Children become attached to providers who give them advantages." Sarah's objection was sustained, but Cooper had made his point to the jury. The second week focused on Derek and Susan's testimony, which became increasingly difficult to watch. Under direct examination, they presented themselves as young people who'd made a terrible mistake, but had genuinely loved me. "I was 19 years old with no family support and no money," Susan testified, crying on cue. Derek was 21 and working 2 minimum-wage jobs. "We were overwhelmed and desperate. Leaving Ashton at the mall was the worst decision of our lives, but we thought someone would find him and give him better care than we could provide." "We never stopped loving him," Derek added. "We thought about him every day. We hoped he'd found a good family, and we're grateful to Mr. Richardson for taking care of him. But Ashton is still our son, and we deserve the chance to be part of his life." But Sarah's cross-examination exposed the contradictions in their stories. "Mr. Walsh, you testified that you thought about Ashton every day for 22 years. "Yes. But you made no effort to contact him until you learned about his inheritance. We didn't know how to find him. You didn't contact the Denver Police Department who handled your son's case. We were afraid they'd arrest us. You didn't contact Denver Social Services. We didn't think they'd help. You didn't hire a private investigator until 6 months ago." Derek hesitated. "We couldn't afford one before." "But you could afford to move to Las Vegas, change your names, and start new lives. That was different." Sarah introduced the parental rights termination documents, which Derek and Susan admitted signing voluntarily to avoid prosecution for child endangerment. "You chose to give up your legal rights as Ashton's parents rather than face consequences for neglecting him. "We were scared and young," Susan said defensively. "You were scared of taking responsibility for your actions. We were scared of going to jail. So you abandoned your legal rights to your son to protect yourselves from consequences." Cooper's objection was overruled. "Yes," Susan finally admitted. "The trial's most dramatic moment came when I took the stand to testify about my relationship with Thomas. Cooper's cross-examination was designed to portray me as either naive or complicit in Thomas's alleged manipulation. Mr. Richardson, isn't it true that you knew Thomas Richardson was wealthy long before he died?" "I knew he had more money than our lifestyle suggested, but I didn't know the extent of his wealth." "You knew he had expensive art and mysterious clients." "I knew he worked with art authentication, but I didn't understand his business completely." "Did you ever consider that his secrecy might be inappropriate?" "Thomas taught me to respect people's privacy and confidentiality." "Did you ever wonder why a wealthy man would choose to live so modestly?" "Thomas taught me that wealth doesn't determine character." Cooper tried for over an hour to establish that I'd been either manipulated by Thomas or complicit in defrauding my biological parents. But his questions only reinforced my genuine love and respect for the man who'd raised me. On Friday afternoon, Judge Williams heard closing arguments from both sides. Cooper's closing was an emotional appeal, designed to tug at the jury's sympathies for Derek and Susan while casting doubt on Thomas's motivations. "This case represents a fundamental choice about family and justice," Cooper argued. "Yes, Derek and Susan Walsh made a terrible mistake when they were young and desperate. But they never stopped being Ashton's parents, and they never stopped loving him. Thomas Richardson may have provided excellent care, but he also used his wealth to permanently separate a child from his biological family for his own emotional gratification." Sarah's closing was methodical and devastating. "This case is not about family love," she said. "It's about financial desperation. Derek and Susan Walsh had 22 years to find their son if they genuinely missed him. They had 22 years to demonstrate parental love and concern. Instead, they lived their lives as if Ashton Richardson had never existed until they learned he'd inherited money. That's not parental love. That's opportunistic greed." Judge Williams announced that she would render her verdict the following Monday morning. But Sunday evening, everything changed. I was at home preparing for what I expected would be either complete vindication or devastating loss when my phone rang. The caller identified herself as Judge Williams' clerk. "Mr. Richardson, I'm calling to inform you that Judge Williams has recused herself from your case due to a conflict of interest that came to light during deliberations. The case is being transferred to family court and will be heard by a different judge Monday morning. Please report to the courthouse at 8 a.m. for the new proceedings." "What kind of conflict of interest?" I asked. "I'm not authorized to discuss details, but the new judge will explain everything during Monday's hearing." I called Sarah immediately. "This is unprecedented," she said. "I've never seen a judge recuse herself after closing arguments, but before verdict. Something significant must have been discovered." That night I couldn't sleep. After 3 weeks of testimony and months of preparation, the case was being started over with a new judge who would have to review all the evidence and make a fresh decision. Monday morning, I arrived at the courthouse to discover the case had been transferred to Family Court Division C, which handled juvenile and adoption matters. The courtroom was smaller and more informal than where we'd spent the past 3 weeks. At exactly 8 a.m., the bailiff announced the entrance of the presiding judge. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Ashton Richardson." Derek, Susan, and Bradley Cooper stared in shock as I walked through the door wearing judicial robes, took my place behind the bench, and looked down at the 3 people who'd been trying to take everything Thomas had left me. "Good morning," I said calmly. "Please be seated." Cooper jumped to his feet, his face red with outrage. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. Mr. Richardson is the defendant. In this case, He cannot preside over his own trial. Mr. Cooper, I replied evenly, I am no longer the defendant in this case. I am Judge Richardson of Family Court Division C, and this case has been transferred to my jurisdiction for final determination. Please, sit down. The shocked silence in the courtroom was deafening. The appointment I'd received 3 months earlier to serve as a juvenile court judge had been confidential until the swearing-in ceremony, which had been scheduled for the previous Friday, but postponed due to the trial. When Judge Williams discovered that I was her colleague designate in the family court system, she'd immediately recused herself to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Family Court Division C had jurisdiction over all matters involving child welfare adoption and parental rights, which meant Walsh via's Richardson estate fell directly under my authority as the newest member of Colorado's family court system. Cooper was on his feet again, his composure completely shattered. Your Honor, I move for immediate recusal. You cannot possibly be impartial in a case involving your own inheritance. Mr. Cooper, your motion is noted and denied. I replied, I have reviewed the applicable judicial ethics guidelines with the State Bar Association. No conflict of interest exists because this case involves the welfare of children and parental fitness, which falls within my specialized jurisdiction. My personal history with child abandonment actually enhances my qualifications to evaluate the evidence in this matter. Derek and Susan were staring at me as if I'd materialized from another dimension. The people who'd abandoned their 5-year-old son were now facing that same child, grown up, and wearing the robes of judicial authority over their fate. I have reviewed all testimony and evidence from the previous proceedings. I continued, I will now render judgment in the matter of Walsh v. Richardson estate. Cooper made one final desperate attempt to derail the proceedings. Your Honor, my clients request a continuance to prepare arguments for a different jurisdiction. Mr. Cooper, your clients filed this lawsuit claiming superior parental rights over a child welfare matter. They have received due process, presented their evidence, and had ample opportunity to establish their claims. This court will now rule on the evidence presented. I opened the case file and began reading my decision. The central question before this court is whether Derek and Susan Walsh possess legitimate parental standing to claim inheritance rights on behalf of Ashton Richardson, whom they abandoned 22 years ago. I looked directly at Derek and Susan, who seemed to shrink under my gaze. The evidence clearly establishes that on March 15, 2001, Derek and Susan Walsh voluntarily abandoned their 5-year-old son in a public shopping mall with no provisions for his care or safety. They made no effort to retrieve him, contacted no authorities to ensure his welfare, and disappeared from Colorado entirely. Cooper started to rise, but I continued without pause. The evidence further establishes that 3 months later, when located by social services in Nevada, Derek and Susan Walsh voluntarily signed legal documents terminating their parental rights to avoid prosecution for child endangerment and neglect. I held up the termination documents Sarah had introduced as evidence. These documents, signed under oath and properly witnessed, explicitly state that Derek and Susan Walsh voluntarily relinquish all parental rights responsibilities and claims to the minor child known as Ashton Walsh, believing such termination to be in the child's best interest. Susan was crying now, but these weren't the controlled tears she'd displayed during testimony. These were tears of genuine panic as she realized what was happening. Mr. Cooper's argument that this termination was signed under duress fails for 3 reasons. First, Derek and Susan Walsh were facing prosecution because of their own criminal behavior in abandoning and neglecting their child. Second, they were offered alternatives including supervised reunification, which they declined. Third, they made no effort to contact their son or reverse their decision during the subsequent 22 years. I turned my attention to the inheritance claim itself. The court finds that Derek and Susan Walsh have no legal standing whatsoever to claim inheritance rights on behalf of Ashton Richardson. They voluntarily terminated their parental relationship, never established any subsequent relationship, and demonstrated no interest in Ashton Richardson's welfare until learning of his inheritance. Cooper was frantically taking notes, probably planning his appeal strategy, but I wasn't finished. Furthermore, the evidence establishes that Derek and Susan Walsh's current financial crisis stems from a pattern of irresponsible behavior, including failed business ventures, gambling addiction, and debts to criminal organizations. Their motivation for this lawsuit is transparently financial rather than parental. I set down the case file and looked directly at the three people who'd tried to destroy everything Thomas had built for me. The court finds that Thomas Richardson acted appropriately in providing care for an abandoned child, followed all legal procedures for adoption, and developed a genuine parent-child relationship based on love sacrifice and mutual respect. His bequest to Ashton Richardson represents the natural culmination of 20 years of devoted parenting. Derek was shaking his head in disbelief, still unable to process that the 5-year-old child he'd abandoned was now the judge determining his fate. Therefore, this court rules as follows. The lawsuit filed by Derek and Susan Walsh is dismissed with prejudice. They have no claim to the Richardson estate, no parental rights to Ashton Richardson, and no legal standing to challenge the inheritance distribution. I paused, then delivered the final blow. Additionally, this court finds that Derek and Susan Walsh filed this lawsuit in bad faith, with full knowledge that they had no legitimate legal standing. Under Colorado civil procedure, frivolous lawsuits may result in sanctions against the plaintiffs. Derek and Susan Walsh are hereby ordered to pay all legal fees and court costs incurred by the Richardson estate in defending against this frivolous litigation. Cooper's face went white. Legal fees for a 3-week trial with expert witnesses and extensive discovery would easily exceed $100,000. Money Derek and Susan clearly didn't have. Finally, I continued, this court is forwarding all evidence of Derek and Susan Walsh's financial circumstances to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for potential prosecution on charges related to money laundering and criminal conspiracy. That was the killing stroke. If Derek owed money to organized crime figures, having law enforcement investigate his finances would make his situation much worse than it already was. This case is closed. I announced, bringing down my gavel. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Derek, Susan, and Cooper sat in stunned silence. Their legal gamble had not only failed completely, it had made their situation catastrophically worse. Sarah approached the bench with a satisfied smile. Congratulations, Your Honor. That was the most thorough demolition of a frivolous lawsuit I've ever witnessed. They brought it on themselves, I replied. Thomas taught me that actions have consequences, and some people only learn through experiencing those consequences directly. 6 months later, I received an update on Derek and Susan's situation through court records. They'd filed for bankruptcy, lost their house to foreclosure, and were facing federal investigation for tax evasion related to Derek's business dealings. Susan had entered rehabilitation for gambling addiction, and Derek was working as a night security guard to pay court-ordered restitution. But the story didn't end with their punishment. 2 years after the trial, Susan contacted my office requesting a private meeting. She looked completely different. Older, humbler, wearing simple clothes and no makeup. Most importantly, she looked genuinely remorseful for the first time since I'd known her. I don't expect forgiveness, she said, sitting across from my desk in chambers. I don't even deserve the chance to apologize. But I needed you to know that losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me. She explained that bankruptcy and public humiliation had forced her to confront her gambling addiction and the selfish choices that had defined her entire adult life. I've been in therapy for 18 months, she continued. I'm working as a cashier at a grocery store, living in a 1-bedroom apartment, and attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings 3 times a week. For the first time in my life, I'm taking responsibility for my actions." Susan reached into her purse and withdrew a small wrapped package. "I know this probably means nothing to you, but I found this in my mother's things after she died last year. It's the only picture I have of you as a baby." The photograph showed a chubby, smiling infant in a high chair, with cake frosting smeared across his face. On the back, someone had written, "Ashton's first birthday," in faded blue ink. "I don't remember taking this picture," Susan said quietly. "I don't remember being the kind of mother who celebrated birthdays or documented milestones. But apparently for at least a moment, I loved you the way parents are supposed to love their children." I studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the happy baby with my memories of abandonment and fear. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because I want you to know that abandoning you wasn't about you being unlovable," Susan replied. "It was about me being incapable of love at that time in my life. You deserved better parents than Derek and me, and Thomas Richardson gave you everything we couldn't." Susan stood to leave, then paused at the door. "I read about your foundation and the work you're doing for abandoned children. Thomas would be proud of the man you became. I'm proud too, for what little that's worth." After she left, I sat in my chambers holding the photograph and thinking about the complicated nature of justice and redemption. Susan's transformation didn't excuse her past behavior, but it represented something Thomas had always believed in: the possibility that people could change if they faced their mistakes honestly. The Richardson Foundation had grown into one of Colorado's most effective child welfare organizations. We'd helped place over 400 children in loving homes, provided legal representation for families navigating adoption procedures, and established training programs for social workers specializing in abandonment trauma. Every case reminded me of my own experience, and Thomas's wisdom about turning pain into purpose. Derek never contacted me, but court records indicated he'd eventually found steady employment and was slowly paying off his debts. He'd remarried a woman with 2 young children, and according to social service records was apparently a devoted stepfather. People could change, even people who'd made unforgivable mistakes. Cooper faced disciplinary action from the Colorado Bar Association for filing a frivolous lawsuit without proper research into his client's legal standing. He was suspended from practicing law for 6 months and required to complete ethics training before reinstatement. But the most meaningful development came 3 years after the trial, when I met Amanda Foster. Amanda was a brilliant attorney who specialized in child advocacy law and had recently joined the foundation as its legal director. She'd grown up in foster care herself after being removed from an abusive home at age 7. Like me, she'd found her calling in protecting children who couldn't protect themselves. We worked together for months before I realized our professional partnership was becoming something deeper. Amanda understood my history without judgment and shared my passion for child welfare work. When I finally asked her to dinner, she laughed and said she'd been waiting for me to notice we were perfect for each other. We were married 2 years later in a ceremony at the courthouse, where I'd rendered judgment against Derek and Susan. Thomas's picture sat on the altar beside fresh flowers, and I felt his presence throughout the ceremony. Amanda and I honeymooned in Italy, visiting art museums and galleries that Thomas had worked with during his authentication career. I finally understood the breadth of his expertise and the respect he'd earned in the international art world. Every curator and dealer we met had stories about Thomas's integrity, knowledge, and kindness. "He sounds like an extraordinary man," Amanda said as we stood before a Michelangelo painting Thomas had authenticated for the Uffizi Gallery. "He was the father every abandoned child dreams of finding," I replied. "He saved my life in every way that matters." Our first adopted children joined our family 18 months later. Marcus and Elena Rodriguez siblings, aged 6 and 8, whose parents had died in a car accident. They'd spent 2 years in foster care, moving between homes and growing increasingly withdrawn and angry. The first few months were challenging as Marcus and Elena tested our commitment and learned to trust that this placement would be permanent. But Amanda and I both understood the fear behind their behavior, and we responded with the same patience Thomas had shown me 25 years earlier. "Are you going to send us back?" Elena asked one evening during her third month with us. "Never," I said, pulling her onto my lap while Amanda cuddled Marcus on the couch. "This is your home forever, no matter what happens." "How do you know?" Marcus asked suspiciously. I showed them the photograph Susan had given me years earlier. The picture of a smiling baby celebrating his first birthday. "This is me when I was little," I explained. "My first parents left me at a shopping mall when I was 5 years old. A wonderful man named Thomas found me and became my real dad. He taught me that family isn't about who shares your blood, but about who chooses to love you every single day." "Did your real dad love you?" Elena asked. "More than anything in the world. And now, Amanda and I love you more than anything in the world. That's how family works. Love gets passed from one person to another, growing stronger each time." Watching Marcus and Elena transform from frightened, angry children into confident, loving kids reminded me daily of the power of patient, consistent love. Thomas's greatest gift hadn't been his money. It had been his example of how broken things could be made whole through dedication and care. The Richardson Foundation continued expanding its reach and impact. We opened a second office in Colorado Springs, established partnerships with child welfare agencies in 3 neighboring states, and created scholarship programs for kids aging out of foster care. Every child we helped represented a victory against the abandonment and neglect I'd experienced myself. Every successful adoption proved that love could triumph over biology, circumstance, and the failures of other adults. On the 20th anniversary of Thomas's death, I stood in his old office above the accounting firm, which had been converted into the foundation's headquarters. The hidden room behind the bookshelf was now a conference space where we planned programs and celebrated successful placements. Amanda found me there as the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting Thomas's old office in golden light. "Thinking about him?" she asked, slipping her arm around my waist. "Thinking about how everything connects," I replied. "If Derek and Susan hadn't abandoned me, I never would have met Thomas. If Thomas hadn't saved me, I never would have become a lawyer or a judge. If I hadn't become a judge, I never would have been able to stop Derek and Susan from stealing what he left me. If they hadn't tried to steal it, I might not have appreciated how much his love really meant. And if you hadn't gone through all of that," Amanda added, "you wouldn't be able to help other abandoned children the way you do now." That evening, Marcus and Elena helped me place fresh flowers on Thomas's grave at Mount Olivet Cemetery. His headstone bore a simple inscription: "Thomas Richardson, beloved father. He made the world better than he found it." Below that, I'd added a line from the letter he'd left me: "The family that chooses you and fights for you is more valuable than the one that shares your blood but abandons you when life gets difficult." "What's the most important thing Thomas taught you?" Elena asked as we walked back to the car. I thought about the question seriously before answering. "He taught me that love is measured in presence, not genetics. He showed me that broken things can be made whole if someone is willing to be patient and consistent. Most importantly, he proved that the pain we survive can become the strength we use to help others." "Is that why you and Amanda adopted us?" Marcus asked. "Partly," I admitted. "But mostly, we adopted you because we fell in love with your courage and your hearts. You two had been through terrible losses, but you never stopped hoping for a family that would keep you forever." As we drove home through the Denver streets where Thomas and I had built our life together, I realized that his greatest gift hadn't been the money he'd left me. It had been the example he'd set of how to transform abandonment into purpose loss, into service, and pain into love. The 5-year-old boy who'd been left at a shopping mall had grown up to become a judge who protected other abandoned children. The man who'd never had a biological family had created a legacy of love that would continue for generations. Thomas had been right about everything that mattered. The family that chooses you really is more valuable than the one that shares your blood but walks away when life becomes difficult. Love really is measured in presence rather than genetics. And the most important thing any of us can do is leave the world better than we found it. That night, as Amanda and I tucked Marcus and Elena into bed, I felt Thomas's presence in our home as clearly as if he'd been standing beside me. His love lived on in every child we'd helped, every family we'd reunited, and every moment of patient care we provided to kids who needed to believe that someone would finally choose to stay. The boy who'd been abandoned had become a man who made sure no child would ever be abandoned again if he had the power to prevent it. That was Thomas's greatest gift. Not wealth, but the wisdom to understand that our deepest wounds can become our most powerful tools for healing others. Derek and Susan had tried to steal my inheritance, but they'd never understood what my real inheritance was. It wasn't money in a bank account. It was love transformed into action pain, converted into purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that every abandoned child deserves someone who will fight for them with everything they have. That inheritance could never be stolen, sued for, or taken away. It was mine forever, and through the foundation, it would belong to abandoned children throughout Colorado for generations to come. Thomas had saved me at a shopping mall 27 years ago. Now his love passed through me to Marcus and Elena, and hundreds of other children would keep saving kids for as long as the Richardson Foundation existed. That was justice. That was redemption. That was how love wins in the end. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone's betrayal actually led to something better in your life? Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for our greatest purposes. Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you've transformed difficult experiences into sources of strength for helping others. Thank you for taking this journey with me today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video to help it reach other people who might need to hear about the power of chosen family and second chances. Subscribe for more stories about resilience, justice, and the triumph of love over abandonment. And share this with someone who understands that our deepest wounds can become our most powerful tools for healing. Remember, you don't have to be defined by the people who walked away from you. You can be defined by the people who chose to stay and the love you choose to give others going forward. Until next time, keep believing that broken things can be made whole, and that the family that chooses you is the family that truly matters.